Let me ask you something. Why would a government keep paying soldiers that could barely fight? If your soldiers were lazy, poorly trained, and not even particularly brave, why wouldn't you just fire them? Of course you'd get rid of a useless army, right? It's just a huge waste of money. It's obvious. But why then, in Imperial China, did governments often keep huge armies that barely functioned as a fighting force? Well, they weren't just stupid. They definitely noticed the problem. But they understood something that's not immediately clear. Getting rid of a worthless army could be far more trouble than it was worth. To understand why, we need to look at how armies actually worked in Imperial China. Part 1. When armies became social groups. By the late Ming dynasty, China's military system had largely decayed. The empire still maintained a hereditary military structure that once included nearly 2 million soldiers. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, many of those troops were poorly trained and rarely effective in real combat. Later, under the Qing dynasty, the government maintained two major forces, the 8 banner armies and the Green Standard troops. Together, they numbered hundreds of thousands. But over time, training declined, equipment was outdated, and discipline deteriorated. So why didn't the government simply disband them and replace them with stronger forces, like the famous Qi family army or the powerful Liaodong cavalry? The answer lies in how these armies were organized. Many soldiers in Imperial China weren't just temporary employees. They belonged to entire military households. Under the Ming dynasty, military service was hereditary. Families were registered as military households, and sons inherited military duty from their fathers. That meant soldiers weren't just individuals. They were entire communities. Entire communities whose livelihoods depended on military service. If the state suddenly dismissed them, it would not just fire a few soldiers, it would destroy the economic foundation of hundreds of thousands of families, and that would create a very dangerous problem. Part 2. The Unemployed Menace. In a modern society, losing your job means you've got to go out and find another one. But in pre-modern China, many soldiers had few alternatives. They were trained for fighting. They were used to living in military communities. And if suddenly unemployed, they couldn't just hop on Indeed and send out 1,000 applications in an afternoon. They were armed men with empty bellies, nothing to lose, and only one marketable skill: war. History shows that this could quite quickly turn into a very real problem for the state. Part 3. The story of Li Zicheng. One of the most important rebel leaders in Chinese history did not begin his life as a soldier. He was a postal relay worker. His job was part of the Imperial Courier Network, which carried official messages across the empire. In modern terms, he was like a postman who delivered things long distance. His name was Li Zicheng. During the late Ming dynasty, the government faced serious financial problems. To reduce expenses, officials decided to cut parts of the postal system. Many workers were dismissed. Li too lost his job. Without income or stable work, he joined growing groups of desperate men. Within a few years, he became a rebel leader. His army expanded rapidly across northern China. In 1644, his forces captured Beijing. The Ming dynasty would collapse shortly afterwards. If a single unemployed courier could help bring down an entire empire, imagine what would happen if the government suddenly dismissed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Part 4. Cheap armies are safer than angry armies. In reality, many imperial soldiers were surprisingly cheap to maintain. Under the Ming system, many troops were given farmland instead of regular salaries. Soldiers farmed their land when they were not on military duty. Unfortunately, over time, much of that land was seized by powerful elites, and so the system became weaker. But the basic structure remained. Under the Qing dynasty, banner and green standard soldiers received fixed stipends. These wages were extremely small. A typical infantry soldier might receive about 1.5 taels of silver per month. A cavalry soldier might receive 2.5, and those salaries barely changed for centuries. And to compound the issue, corruption often meant they received even less. From the government's perspective, keeping these soldiers on the payroll was relatively cheap, but dismissing them could create a massive pool of armed, unemployed men, and that was far more dangerous. Part 5. Armies as social control. Historically, the government often recruited soldiers from the lower margins of society, people who were poor, unemployed, or considered to be potential troublemakers. Why recruit them? Because once they became a soldier, they were supervised, organized, and dependent on the state. In other words, sometimes an army's most important job was not fighting foreign enemies, it was keeping people off the streets and giving them a sense of purpose. Today we think of armies as tools of national defense, but in many pre-modern empires, armies also served another purpose. They were there to manage large numbers of potentially dangerous men. From that perspective, keeping weak soldiers on the payroll was not simply military inefficiency, it was political calculation. Sometimes an army wasn't meant to win wars, it was meant to prevent rebellion.